Source Consultants, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of the Bringing Dreams and Miracles Together podcast. Today, our host, Chris Gao, Client Development Advisor, is joined by a very special guest, Dr. Diana Hakman from HRC Fertility. Together, they'll walk intended parents through what happens once your surrogacy journey officially begins. Dr. Hakman shares her expert insights on the medical timeline, the embryo transfer process, and how you, as intended parents, can stay actively involved and informed every step of the way. From your surrogate's first medical screening to that unforgettable moment of hearing your baby's heartbeat, this episode lays out a clear and compassionate roadmap of what to expect and how to prepare. If you're pursuing parenthood through surrogacy, you won't want to miss this episode. It's full of expert guidance, encouragement, and heart, just like the journey ahead.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Family Source Consultants podcast. My name is Chris Gao, and I'm the Client Development Advisor at Family Source Consultants, and I'll be your host today. In this episode, we'll be talking about things intended parents should know before they start their surrogacy journey. So, if you are someone who is considering building your family through surrogacy, this podcast is for you. And we have the honor of having a very special guest joining us today. Welcome, Dr. Sasha Hakman from HRC Fertility. Hi, Dr. Hakman.
Hi, thank you for having me here.
It's a pleasure to have you. And can you please, introduce yourself to our audience and also a little bit about HRC?
Absolutely. Like Chris mentioned, my name is Sasha Hakman. I'm a double board certified OBGYN and reproductive endocrinology and infertility specialist. So that entails all aspects of infertility, fertility preservation, as well as third party reproduction, of course. I am located in Beverly Hills, California. I work at HRC Fertility. We're a pretty big company located in multiple different areas throughout Southern California, primarily, but entering the Bay Area shortly. And what's really nice about having joined HRC Fertility a couple years ago is that although there are so many locations, we kind of have a boutique practice type feel because every location is very unique and different, and every practice is kind of a practice within a practice, so to speak. So I have my own team and my own process and the way we do things, as well as like my lovely colleagues. We all kind of have our unique styles, which is really great, and so that can provide a lot of variations in your experience, and it's fun. It's unique in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so Dr. Heckman actually did a webinar with us not too long ago. We talked about the things intended parents should look for when they're choosing a fertility clinic. And if you haven't checked out that webinar yet, that is very, very helpful as well. And I'm sure today we'll probably cover a little bit of what we talked about in the webinar, since we're talking about we're basically helping intended parents prepare for their surrogacy journey. And welcome back. We're so glad to have you back, Dr. Heckman.
Thank you. I'm excited to have these conversations.
Absolutely. So, speaking of preparing for a surrogacy journey, I think one of the most commonly asked questions is how long this process takes, right? Because a lot of parents, like, especially when you are just starting to think about building your family through surrogacy, I'm sure a lot of parents will, do research online. There is so much information on the internet. There really is just so much. And a lot of parents say, I don't know how I feel because on one hand, I feel like I found a lot of information, but then on the other hand, I feel overwhelmed. I don't know what
Yes.
information actually applies to me and what not. So in your experience, Dr. Heckman, what do you suggest, parents should expect in terms of a realistic timeline?
So it's sometimes a tough question to answer because the timeline can be incredibly variable depending on medical and social elements that can
Mhm.
impact your targeted timeline. I always say at least expect about a 6 month timeline from beginning to end if you're lucky. This is
Mhm.
assuming that you're able to get in quickly enough into the clinic.
Mhm.
You do your workup, and there are really no major issues that are found.
Mhm,
Part of the surrogacy journey, of course, you want to inform yourself about the type of surrogacy that you're trying to do. The large majority of surrogacy journeys involve using a gestational carrier. So, this is
mhm,
somebody who is going to carry an embryo that was previously developed in a lab, either using the gametes, which includes egg and sperm, of the intended parents, or could be a combination of the intended parent's gametes with donor sperm or donor egg, depending on how a family looks like. And so, if it is sort of, more straightforward in terms of using the intended parent's own gametes, you're now
mhm,
assuming that the IVF process should be straightforward, but we don't
right.
necessarily know if we're going to have any usable embryos from a first IVF cycle, right? And
Mhm, yep,
typically, if you're using it for reasons of infertility, then oftentimes it is common to need more than one IVF cycle to have anything usable for the gestational carrier. Now, even when, let's say, you're talking about same sex couples,
mhm,
especially with same sex male couples, oftentimes the assumption is, well, we have to use fertility treatments to make a baby, but I don't
mhm,
have infertility, so this should be pretty easy. But sometimes we find problems. We might
mhm,
find that sperm is significantly impacted, but
right.
there may be treatments involved, and sometimes those treatments will delay the timeline by up to even 6 months. Now,
Mhm,
of course, it also depends if you're trying to match on your own, like more private matching with a surrogate, a gestational surrogate, versus using an agency, which
mhm,
ultimately streamlines a lot of the process when it comes to a lot of the counseling, the legal aspects, the testing. That certainly can help expedite the timeline quite significantly. And an agency will usually have an easier time finding a match versus going out on your own to more privately find a match for someone, and while that is can be a lot more personal if that's what someone's looking for, you're also assuming that this person will be the right candidate, that they will be
yeah,
medically cleared, and that
absolutely.
they will actually be approved by the fertility clinic. Not to
Mhm,
mention so many psychosocial and legal implications. So when it comes to third party, and especially with surrogacy, you are looking at a much longer timeline as opposed
mhm,
to somebody coming in and saying, "Hey, I just want to get a fertility workup and get started on treatment right away," which tends to be a lot
yep.
faster.
Exactly. I 100% agree with what you just said, Dr. Heckman. And so basically, to summarize what you said, I think you mentioned the shortest, but also like, somewhat realistic timeline for the IVF or the medical process would be like 6 months, right? But,
Correct.
realistically, when you're working with a surrogate or, and also with the possibility of working with an egg donor too, it could be longer just because
Correct.
you don't know what could happen. And like, for example, for parents who, I would say like, yes, this is a long and complicated process. Just the IVF part would take at least 6 months. But then obviously there is the pregnancy and then there's the delivery. Altogether, we're looking at, I would say about at least a year and a half, right? But so, I think there are certain
Mm.
factors that parents cannot really control. For example, like some of the things you just mentioned. Sometimes it may take more than one attempt to successfully create viable embryos, right? And sometimes it may take more than one attempt for the surrogate to be pregnant, to achieve a healthy pregnancy. So, these are the factors I say like, parents or anyone basically can't really control. But then there are some other factors parents can somewhat control. For example, unless a parent already has a surrogate they're going to work with, either they found on their own or it's a friend, a family member. If a parent doesn't have a surrogate yet, they need to find a surrogate, right? So I would say a lot of parents, will start their journey with a surrogacy agency, and also a lot of parents will start their journey with a clinic. And, obviously either is fine, but, these two parties you will have to work with no matter what, unless you find your own surrogate, then, you don't necessarily have to work with an agency. But assuming you need to work with an agency to find a surrogate, and also, some parents would choose to start the surrogate matching process while they're working on embryo creation because
Yeah,
that will obviously save them some time. And
absolutely.
at Family Source Consultants, our average match time is about 6 months. So, a lot of parents choose this route to save some time. Okay, I have selected my fertility clinic and I have selected my surrogacy agency and I'm creating embryos and starting the matching process at the same time. So that would save parents some time, but then some other parents would rather focus on creating embryos first, just because be like, okay, there's a lot going on in my life right now, and I'd rather focus on one thing at a time. And creating embryos makes more sense because obviously I wouldn't be able to transfer without any embryos created first. So if that's the case, that's totally fine. But do know that your timeline may be a little bit longer. So I would say this is, one of the factors that parents can't control.
Yes, absolutely. I do think that if you do your research ahead of time to see, what agency you want to work with, what fertility you want to work with, getting in pretty quickly with a fertility practice to do the initial
Mhm,
workup to see what you're working with. And that can
mhm,
sort of help you gauge really what a more realistic timeline could look like as you're trying to get matched to a gestational carrier while concurrently undergoing IVF. Because ultimately, if you're going through IVF using both intended parents' gametes, so we're talking egg and
mhm.
sperm in a heterosexual couple, for example, then
Right.
that tends to be a little bit faster. And usually within a 2 month time frame, you can probably get started on the ovarian stimulation side of things to then
Mhm.
create embryos within a month of that. So you're talking approximately on average 3 to 4 months if you are really motivated and
Yeah.
getting done quickly.
Right.
Now, in terms of needing donor sperm or donor eggs, that does traditionally increase the timeline because you have to not only wait for your genetic carrier screening to come back, and that is a test to determine whether you are a carrier for certain inherited diseases
Mhm.
so that you can pick the sperm or eggs according to what your genetic status looks like so that there are no diseases overlapping that could then be passed on to your children. That
Yeah.
test usually takes 2 to 3 weeks to come back currently is the
Mhm.
turnaround time. And then,
Mhm.
at that point, now you're starting to look at these possible candidates, assuming you're looking at a sperm bank or an egg bank. But
Mhm.
there are also people out there there are parents out there who really want to look at private donation as well when it comes to
Yep.
sperm and eggs. They want to
Absolutely.
feel connected to the person who is providing genetic material for their future offspring. So it definitely, there's a ton of variation there in the timeline because everybody's journey looks so different. So even when I said 6 months, it's just sort of like a random number you pull out of thin air because it's really hard. It's just more of a guesstimate, but really there's so much variation in that timeline. And as someone who works with a lot of couples who choose the surrogacy route or need to use the surrogacy route, there's a lot of variation in that timeline, but you have to expect it's not going to be a quick thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's not going to be a quick thing, but obviously I think, working in this field, we understand every parent wants to have a child as soon as possible, and sometimes you be sometimes parents be like, oh, why would it take that long? It's just, a medical process I have to go through. But just note that every professional involved in your journey wants you to succeed, and I think if we're doing our job right, we will help you set realistic expectations. And, we don't want to just tell parents, oh, you can get things done in within 3 months when realistically, is probably a little bit more at can things possibly be done within 3 months? I'm sure there is a possibility of if everything, the universe lines up perfectly, it's possible, but I would say, like, just like Dr. Hackman said, realistically, we're looking at just the medical process itself, probably at least 6 months.
Yeah.
Um, and speaking of this process, obviously, when a parent is working with a surrogate, it's a little bit more complicated than just creating embryos and then transferring the embryos because there is a third party involved. And even if there's no egg donor or sperm donor, the surrogate is still considered a third party. And when that is, when there's a third party involved, parents will also have to sign a legal contract with the surrogate. And typically, the legal contract takes place between the surrogate receives her medical clearance from the fertility center and the beginning of the embryo transfer cycle. So that is also something we need to take to consideration. That obviously is going to take some time. I would say on average, the legal process takes about 4 to 6 weeks to complete. And some parents may ask, oh, why does that take that long? Well, that's because it's a very detailed contract, and parents and
Yes.
surrogates have to work with independent legal representations, and the two parties will draft the contracts and discuss, negotiate, and make some changes, and eventually finalize and fully sign it. So this process adds some time to your timeline as well.
Absolutely. Yes. Um, there's a lot that goes into this contract for several reasons because,
Hmm.
we talked about this also in the webinar that you have to consider the IP's future child, that
Hmm.
being their child, their fetus, but also the GC, which stands for gestational carrier. So the woman carrying the pregnancy, we have to consider her bodily autonomy. And ultimately, the IP and GC's values have to align on all things before they can move forward. And there's a lot
Hmm.
of implications to carrying somebody else's pregnancy. And, you have to think about the GC's own family. So,
Hmm.
does she have a partner? Does she have children? What does her home life look like? Is it a safe environment? Is she a good candidate? We always recommend some sort of psychologic counseling or even screening because
Hmm.
I mean, just imagine like that it's natural for this woman to potentially even get really significantly attached to this baby that's growing inside her body.
Yeah.
And so there we have to ensure that there isn't some sort of massive emotional attachment where they're coming back and saying, well, wait a minute, I want to have rights to this child because it's not,
Right.
it's not their child. But then also, when you are pregnant, you become part of this vulnerable population as well. So it's important to
Hmm.
also know that home life is a safe place, and that, there all the implications throughout the pregnancy involved, such as elective termination, possible need
Hmm.
for additional procedures for the patient in order
Yep.
to protect the baby. So there's a lot of implications. Also, how involved is the GC going to be in communicating with the IP, the intended
Hmm.
parents? Um,
Hmm.
and what happens after delivery? What happens when it comes to lactating? Is there some sort of an agreement with breastfeeding as well, or, donating milk? So all of these things need to be discussed prior to actually pursuing treatment with the use of a specific GC that a couple was matched with or an individual was matched with.
Absolutely, and I love how in depth you just went talking about this. I know we're just talking about the timeline, and we went so deep, and I hope parents find this very, very helpful because there really is a lot of information to be shared with the parents who are thinking about building their families via surrogacy, and that's what we're here for. We're here to really spread our knowledge from working in the field, and hopefully to help parents really have a realistic understanding and expectation of this process. And okay, so that's a timeline. I know we mentioned it a few times that, the parents have to work with multiple parties, and obviously the clinic is a big element of any surrogacy journey, surrogacy agency as well, if parents need to find a surrogate. And on top of that, parents will need to work with attorneys, and like at least one attorney. And generally, that attorney will represent the intended parents. If they need an egg donor or sperm donor, a fresh donation, they need to sign a contract with their egg donor or sperm donor. And then when it comes to the surrogacy part, they need to sign a contract with the surrogate. So, intended parents will need to work with at least one attorney. And then there will be the insurance company involved and escrow management company involved. So, I know we already talked about in our webinar, we already talked about how to choose a fertility clinic. Can we just, recap, very briefly? Dr. Hackman, can you just recap for us what are the things parents should consider when they're looking for a fertility clinic to work with?
So there's a number of things that you should consider. Number one, I would say, is knowing that the clinic is well versed in working with both surrogacy, GCs, as well as surrogacy agencies, especially if you plan on traveling for your treatment. You
Mhm,
want to know that a particular clinic has the infrastructure to make it as relatively easy of an experience as possible. So if
mhm,
they have the staffing that is necessary for working through a third party, for instance, like at HRC, in our particular clinic location, we have somebody specifically designated for third party reproduction. And
mhm,
so this person, she knows all the ins and outs, and she's
mhm,
our superstar nurse that really helps coordinate all of it. And as demands grow, you start to hire more and more teammates to sort of streamline this. So that's one really
right.
important aspect of choosing a clinic. The other one
Mhm,
is looking at the lab success rate, because of
mhm,
course, choosing the right doctor who is really going to listen to you, give you that positive experience, give you the good care that you deserve, they're still limited by the lab. And so knowing that a lab has really up to date, top of the line, standard of care
mhm,
laboratory practices is really, really important. Using things like SART or SART.org can be helpful. Of
mhm,
course, I always say take the success rates on SART with a grain of salt, because there are practices who will really turn down a lot of couples who have a poor prognosis because they
right.
don't want to negatively impact their pregnancy rates. And
Mhm,
similarly, there are other practices who will take anybody who really wants to do whatever treatment they want to. And so that can
mhm,
also negatively impact their pregnancy rates. What you're ultimately looking for is somewhere within the average within that area. So if you're
mhm,
comparing clinics, you want to compare within that geographic area.
mhm,
If they're plus minus, a few percentages, then they're probably really doing a good job.
right.
And then, of course, just talking specifically once you go in for that initial consultation to the doctor to understand more based on your specific demographic, what
Mhm,
your own success looks like from that particular lab's data.
mhm, mhm. Yeah.
So yeah, so we're talking, knowing that the clinic has the infrastructure for third party
Mhm,
reproduction. Secondly, knowing that the lab is very well equipped and has good pregnancy rates and good success rates. And then, of course, number three, making sure that you match with a physician who really helps you through this journey, because it could be a very difficult one in many cases. And so you want
absolutely.
someone who's really going to be your cheerleader, be by your side, properly
Mhm.
counsel you, explain everything so that you really understand what's going on, and that the overall experience will be more positive.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's very, very important. Just to recap what you said, the experience with specifically surrogacy cases the clinic has, and the success rates or the embryology lab, and the personal touch. And it's very important for any parents to work with any team that makes them feel comfortable. And on top of an already difficult journey or process the parent may have gone through, in the infertility journey. I do think, you totally nailed it. It's very, very important to choose a team that you just feel completely comfortable working with,
Totally. And I really
right?
think a big part of that too is the communication aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that I'll often get feedback on from patients is that because, for me personally, I will do a lot of my patients' ultrasounds.
Mm-hmm.
Rarely will have the sonographer do it because I like that touch point, and it's an opportunity for them to ask questions when they feel that
Yes.
they can easily get a hold of their coordinator, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
via email or phone, whatever it looks like, just that
Mm-hmm.
easy access to be able to ask questions, to be able to reach out to your
Yes.
doctor and get
Mm-hmm.
clarification on things. That's a really, really important part of the process because if you feel like you're
Mm-hmm.
constantly having to chase after the clinic to even just be able to get one question answered, then that can make things really tough.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, I feel like, because you and we work in the field, sometimes we know, okay, this is not, as serious as a problem, but a lot of parents don't know, like, because, especially for parents who are going through this process for the first time, if anything happens, they may think, oh my gosh, is this right? Is this wrong? Or, like, this is an urgent situation. And sometimes we know, okay, it's not that serious, but again, parents don't know and they want to get a hold of someone. They want someone to
Yeah.
answer their questions right away. And I think that is very important. HRC, provides such high standard customer service as well, on top of the medical services, obviously.
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a big deal. I mean, it does help that, in my case personally, I was on the patient side of things.
Uh,
I also encountered some negative experiences before I switched clinics, and this was long before I was in private practice. But
mhm.
when I was doing my own IVF cycle and just trying to get a hold of the first practice that I was taking care at, it felt like, nearly impossible. And
Right, right.
it can be really tough. And sometimes as unfortunate as it is that I had to experience what I did, it also made for like a really good perspective, knowing on the patient side of things what things really matter and can be important
Absolutely.
from the patient perspective. And although our goal is always outcome driven, that is not the only thing.
Absolutely. And like at Family Service Consultants, we absolutely value that as well. And we wholeheartedly believe people who have gone through similar experiences will be able to understand and relate to the parents better just because you've gone through it yourself and what emotions you went through when you were in the process and what things could easily, I guess not necessarily easily, like what things could make you, I guess, freak you out a little bit, like just because of the unknown. I feel like a lot of times it's the unknown. I just don't know. This is not my expertise and
Yeah.
I'm doing this for the first time. I don't know if
Mm.
this is normal or not. I don't know if this is a good sign or a bad sign. So we actually, FSC, when we hire employees, and we definitely prefer the people who have some sort of personal experience with,
Yeah.
reproductive treatments for third-party reproduction.
Yeah. I really do believe that makes a big difference. It really
Mhm.
does. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would say on my end, I wanted to share a little bit about like, choosing an agency for parents because again, that
Yeah.
is another big, I guess an important element parents will have to look into. How do parents look for an agency? I would say again, there are so many agencies in the country and, different agencies operate differently. I always, tell parents talk to the agencies and read about them and look them up, look up the reviews and try to talk to some of their clients that went through the process with them and ask about their experience, but also very, very importantly, talk to the agencies and talk to the agency you're interested in.
Mhm.
I would say really ask questions, not just general questions about surrogacy, but questions about your specific case, your specific scenario. Every case is different, and some parents need to work with an egg donor, some parents don't. Some parents live in certain states. Some parents live in more friendly states, and some parents are single parents, some parents are,
Right.
heterosexual couples, gay couples. It's all different, and really get to know the agency. And I think one of the most important things is really to evaluate what agency is sharing with you, the information the agency shares with you. And working at an agency, I always want my intended parents to have realistic understanding and expectations of the surrogacy process. I never want them to jump into this process thinking, okay, it's gonna be a piece of cake. It is gonna be so easy, and I don't have to get very involved, and I'm just gonna, the next thing I'm gonna do is to pick up my baby. No, it is not the case. Parents will need to be very involved in this process, and if any agency says anything that may be a little too good to be true,
It
I would
usually
take
is.
right. I would take it as a red flag, and at least ask follow-up questions, and don't just be like, "Oh, okay, that's what I want to hear. They're just telling me everything I want to hear." Yes, that may make you feel good in the moment, but it doesn't really help you in the long run. So that is always, the number one thing I tell intended parents. Don't like a good agency will help you set up realistic expectations, and will help you understand what could potentially go wrong. And of course, we all hope every journey is smooth and easy as can be, but it doesn't always happen. And because there are so many parties involved, sometimes there could be hiccups. And I do think a good agency will prepare intended parents for those things up front, not just tell them, things they want to hear.
Absolutely. And the unfortunate side of the business of our job is oftentimes we have to deliver bad news, and it's not easy. So the
Mhm.
question is, who do you want delivering that bad news to you?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
do you feel at ease with these people who may have to do that?
Yeah.
Excuse me.
And in addition to the clinic and the agency, attorney is also a big part of this journey. And some parents will ask, "Oh, how do I find an attorney? Like, do I need to find my own attorney and stuff?" I would say a lot of times, the agency and the clinic will have recommendations for surrogacy attorneys. And, attorneys, it kind of really depends on where the intended parents live. And when it comes to an attorney for the surrogate, it also depends on where the surrogate lives. But from the intended parents' perspective, their attorney, sometimes it needs to be licensed in the state where the parents live. Sometimes the attorney doesn't. It just all different. I would say, a lot of times, again, like the agency and the clinic will have recommendations to intended parents, and those are typically the attorneys that the agency and the clinic have worked with, and they feel like, oh,
Right.
they provide high standard services, and other parents really like them. That's why they're recommending them to the intended parents.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly.
Yeah. But regardless, and I do think, before starting any surrogacy journey, in addition to doing your research online, talk to these professionals as early as you can.
Yes.
Once you've decided to go to pursue surrogacy, or even just thinking about surrogacy as an option, talk to the professionals, talk to the fertility centers, talk to the agency, and talk to the attorneys, and see what you can really expect, to happen in your case, and understand the cost, understand the timeline, understand the things you should prepare yourself for.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And and then the cost is obviously another big
Yeah.
topic. Parents will always ask, and I
Yeah.
always tell parents when it comes to the cost, there are generally three buckets. You wanna think about the medical services. So the cost of the medical services typically will get billed by the IVF center directly, and so the IVF clinic will be able to give you a quote based on your insurance coverage, which is a whole another topic. So
Oh, yeah.
parents, right? A lot of parents may have some sort of insurance coverage on fertility services, but what exactly the coverage is and how much exactly will cover it, it's different based on the policy. But then, the clinic will be able to verify the insurance benefits and provide an estimate, for the services that are not covered by insurance. So that is the medical expense bucket. And then another bucket would be generally non-medical expenses. So that'll include agency fees and attorney fees and surrogates compensation and additional costs, for example, surrogates travel expenses and lost wages and all those things. And then there's another bucket. Another bucket would be insurance costs. The surrogate, specifically surrogates health insurance and newborn insurance. But newborn insurance typically only applies to parents who do not have health insurance in the United States. So most likely international intended parents.
Right.
So for domestic intended parents, as long as you have health insurance, you can add your baby to your policy within 30 days after the baby's born to cover the newborn, so you don't have to worry about that. But then the surrogate's health insurance is still something we have to consider because it is
Right.
very, very important for the surrogate to have insurance coverage from basically the date she gets released to her OB, because from there on she's going to her OB's office for
Right.
routine monitoring, and then most importantly, delivery at a
Right.
hospital. We just never know how much the bill would be without insurance coverage, and even if it's simple C-section without insurance, it could still be a large medical bill the parents have to face. So it's very important to have that. Clarified upfront before the surrogate goes through the embryo transfer cycle. And if the surrogate's own insurance is eligible for surrogacy, great. Parents have the option to purchase a secondary policy for her, but it's not necessarily required. But if the surrogate's own insurance is not friendly towards surrogacy, then parents will have to pay for another policy, and that is what I call a third bucket.
Yes. Yeah.
um, so yeah, again, I would say the overall cost, the non-medical, the second bucket, really, the agency fees and surrogate compensation and travel expenses and legal fees together, I would say on average, we're looking at, my best estimate is about 130 to, it could be up to $170,000. And again, every case is a little different just because sometimes, surrogate gets pregnant after just one embryo transfer. Sometimes it takes multiple transfers, and the expense, there will obviously be additional costs if there are additional embryo transfers. Every case is a little different, but that's truly my best estimate for the middle bucket. And I know when it comes to the medical expense, it's nearly impossible to have an estimate just because patients have different insurance coverage, and patients need different treatments and different services. If you
Right.
could provide like a range or an average range for us, that'd be great. But if it's too
Yeah.
complicated, that's totally understandable as well.
I mean, I would say that the average for a single IVF cycle in a
Mhm.
heterosexual couple without
Mhm.
having to use donor sperm or eggs is
Right.
traditionally around $25,000, give or take.
Mhm.
Obviously, there could be add-ons, things that make it slightly more expensive. But now, if you're
Right.
adding in any donor gametes, then that definitely
Mhm.
drives up the price. Sperm is
Yes.
certainly less expensive than eggs for obvious
Mhm.
reasons because sperm
Mhm.
is a lot easier to acquire compared
Mhm.
to eggs.
Mhm.
Donor eggs come from the female donors essentially going through an ovarian stimulation cycle and
Mhm.
undergoing an egg retrieval. So
Right.
that certainly drives up the price. So you're certainly adding, potentially up to $10,000 more in costs there,
Mhm.
assuming that the first cycle is successful. Also depends
Right.
on the number of eggs that you're purchasing because they
Mhm.
usually come in lots of six.
Mhm.
That being said, if you're looking to potentially have more than one child, then you have to have realistic discussion of your family building goals with your physician. So
Mhm.
let's say even if you plan on using a gestational carrier, for one baby at a time, you want to be as financially efficient as possible. And doing
Mhm.
potentially one IVF cycle for
Right.
multiple embryos for future siblings should be a
Mhm.
goal rather than coming to do sort of de novo IVF cycles for each child, that's incredibly inefficient. And while that may be the case for certain individuals and couples, depending on their situation, it
Mhm.
generally, if you have a good prognosis and you're of a younger age, then you may be successful in having enough embryos from one IVF cycle for
Mhm.
multiple children. And so these are
Right.
goals that you should always discuss with your doctor and
Yeah.
not be sort of short-sighted of just dealing with the first baby, but rather thinking long term, how many kids do you want? Especially if we're
Absolutely.
dealing with a woman who is in her late 30s, possibly even early 40s, then at that point, absolutely there should be embryo banking.
Mhm.
It could still happen concurrently, but those things will definitely drive up the cost because now you're talking about multiple IVF cycles
Yeah,
potentially.
absolutely. And I wish we could be a little bit more helpful in terms of narrowing
Yeah,
down how much the cost would be. But the truth is, unfortunately, no one can tell you how much exactly surrogacy is going to
right.
cost. And if anyone tells you this is exactly how much surrogacy is going to cost, run from that. Just because it
Yes.
unfortunately is not true.
There's too much variation in every single case because this isn't a one size fits all whatsoever.
Yeah, exactly. Oh well, I think we actually covered a lot. We covered a lot today, and I know we're mostly, we're focusing on things parents should know before they start their surrogacy journey. And just to recap, we talked about a rough timeline parents should understand what to expect or how long they can expect to commit to this journey. And again, in short, every case is a little different, and what we're able to share today is, based on to the best of our knowledge, what we think is average is realistic. And so we talked about the timeline, and we talked about how to choose a fertility center, a surrogacy agency, and surrogacy attorneys. And we talked about the potential cost, or a very rough estimate cost of the medical services and the non-medical services. And my last advice to the parents, again, I kind of mentioned it early on, if you are even just thinking about surrogacy, your research and reach out to the professionals and talk to them, because you truly will learn so much more by talking to the professionals, and understand what will apply to you and what not. And by talking to professionals, you will also have a more clear understanding of how much you should prepare before you start this journey.
Absolutely. Great advice, Chris.
Thank you so much, Dr. Heckman. And obviously, there's so much more we didn't get to touch today. And stay tuned. We'll come back for part two, and part two will focus on the things parents should know after they start their circus after they start their journey. So while they're in the middle of their surrogacy journey, what they should know and how they should prepare themselves.
Sounds great.
Okay, well, thank you again, Dr. Heckman, for joining us and for such a great discussion. And stay tuned, everyone. We'll be back for part two.
Thank you again, Chris.
All right, thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.